Okay, I'm going to get started and we will still obviously let everybody in as they join us. So welcome to Exemplify number 4, brought to you by Select Path Benefits and Financial. My name is Melissa Maloney and I am the Chief Operating Officer here at Select Path and super excited to bring our guests to you today. I initially met Paula a couple months ago and she has created an absolutely amazing program for children when it comes to helping them understand their own mental wellness. And she has done that in partnership with Dr. Colin King, who is going to be our main speaker today. So very excited to introduce him so that we can all spend some time learning about how we can support our young people right now. So Dr. Colin King is the director of the Mary J. Wright Child and Youth Development Clinic at Western University, and an associate professor in the Faculty of Education. As a school and clinical child psychologist, he has worked and trained in a variety of hospital, community, private practice, and educational settings, working with children and youth with various learning, social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. Most recently, Colin worked in a private practice as a school psychologist and coordinator of psychological services with the Thames Valley District School Board. Colin's ongoing research work includes making practices in school psychology more readily available to parents and communities and delivering innovative clinical models to support anxiety difficulties in children and youth. So very excited to pass this show over to Dr. Colin King. It is all yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you to this Select Path team for having me here today. I'm going to just pull up my slide deck here. And we're really excited that we're having this conversation because I know we were talking about mental health prior to the pandemic, but boy, I really feel that this is on our radars and in our conversations now for lots of folks. So thank you again for having me here today. So my name is Colin. I'm the director of our training clinic at Western University at the Mary J. Wright CYDC and school and child clinical psychologist. And I bring kind of my presentation here today, certainly with kind of that professional lens and understanding, but also from a parent lens there as well. So I'm the father of 2 young boys, age 6 and age 9. And boy, when I think about, some of the impact of the pandemic and kind of mental health of kids and families, I'm always reflecting on my own family as a little bit of a microcosm around that experience as well. So I'll hopefully be introducing some threads of my own personal experience kind of through today's presentation here. So for my goals really for this afternoon here are to talk a little bit about the current landscape of mental health for children and youth, to talk about what we know so far around the pandemic related impacts on kids and families, knowing that this is really still an emerging area as we're gathering kind of more data into kind of our work here. I'll share a little bit about our work at the Mary J. Wright Clinic here in partnership with our student trainees, what we're doing to kind of support families and kids who are coming in right now really kind of struggling with mental health. And thrilled to be able to kind of talk a little bit about one of the innovative programs and partnerships that we have at the clinic with Paula Jesty and the MI Friends program. Just a wonderful illustration of some of the types of programming and conversations we really need to have kind of moving forward here. So first, I'd like to start off here by kind of asking a question about how you're doing. And not in a kind of social nicety, kind of fine, whether when we're at the store or kind of passing colleagues in the hallway, but a bit of a reflection here about how you're kind of really feeling. And as I remind my kind of teenage clients all the time, fine is not a feeling. So you can kind of look at the feeling wheel here on the right-hand side to check in with maybe some precise vocabulary about how you're kind of feeling kind of right here at this kind of moment right now. But also perhaps to think a little bit about, if you had to plot that and check in about how your friends and loved ones are doing right now, where would that kind of fall? Are they feeling in a similar way? Are they perhaps kind of doing, having more positive mental health or perhaps kind of really struggling? And conversely, if you do have some kind of children and youth kind of in your lives there as well, perhaps, how are they feeling? How might they kind of answer that kind of check-in model, again, kind of at this kind of precise moment, at this kind of point in time? So I'm always starting off these presentations and conversations with a bit of a reflective kind of check-in piece, because as we're going to be talking about, I think some of the work really moving forward is that it really kind of starts with us, about checking in around our own mental health and well-being to have an accurate gauge of how we're doing, to be able to support others who might be kind of struggling there. And perhaps you've heard the phrase here that we're kind of all in the same storm, but not in the same boat here throughout the pandemic. And I think increasingly, as we're gathering, again, more data and evidence, this is absolutely coming kind of true to life here, that perhaps you've been in a rowboat there, really kind of struggling to hang on over the past 2 years here, trying to manage all the different demands, whether that be health or economic or family-wise. Conversely, perhaps you have had situations and contexts here of perhaps some relative stability or privilege, and perhaps you're on kind of one of the yachts or even that aircraft carrier there, kind of looking out at others who kind of might be struggling, perhaps kind of more than yourself. But I think this is important to, again, reflect in here, because it is really kind of mapping onto some of the effects and research showing here that really the short answer is that it really kind of depends, that it really is a function of some of the context and resources, existing vulnerabilities that we came into the pandemic for, that is having an impact on kind of how we're doing kind of right now. And I think it is great that, again, we're having these conversations around mental health and well-being, because we have kind of been in the same storm here. So what we know is that at this point, the ongoing pandemic has really had a number of kind of impacts on kind of our mental health. Certainly at kind of a base level there, thinking about the stress and worries that we kind of might have, whether it be related to kind of employment, especially early on in the pandemic, as restaurants and various businesses were being shut down. Certainly around health and the uncertainty that comes with that. So even kind of with vaccines and some of the loosening of restrictions there, we know that that uncertainty piece and the concern around health is a true kind of reality there for many folks. And boy, just to kind of further kind of exacerbate things here over the last several months, and whether it be some of the war in Ukraine right now, or some of the continued kind of pressures around inflation and affordability for families, we know that there's a lot on kind of the mental plates here of all adults, but especially families here. Right, and kind of the result of these worries is that, right, is this kind of buildup of all these kind of various feelings, whether it be around kind of fear and kind of worry, to more frustration and anger, or some of the other feelings there that a little bit more of kind of withdrawals, or that be kind of sadness or kind of numbing out of some of the experiences there. We know that it's really had kind of a range of impacts there on kind of our mental health. And again, that's why I'm always starting off with that kind of feeling wheel in the beginning there, about checking in about where we're at kind of right now, knowing that we can probably kind of cycle through a range of different emotions at really kind of any one time. And we know that the mental health impacts have had various impacts there. So whether it be kind of our appetite levels, the energy that we bring to our kind of work and well-being kind of every day, sleep difficulties, the ability to kind of concentrate, and various kind of physical reactions there as well, about some of those feelings of irritability and kind of feeling on edge now, that we know that many people are describing. And what we're knowing now is, again, from some of the research studies that are coming out, is that there have been high rates of depression and anxiety-related symptoms, particularly in adults and among households where there's children. And again, if you're kind of a primary caregiver for a child or youth there during the pandemic, is that your numbers of stress and worries here have probably kind of gone up. And that 60% of families there were reporting increased stress and kind of mental health related challenges. And Dr. Dylan Brown, he's from the University of Waterloo, has really talked about kind of three main categories of pandemic-related stresses, not just for families, but really for everyone. So whether that be kind of economic-related challenges, relational difficulties, so not being able to interact and see our loved ones and have those relationships in the same way, We know that isolation has been a really kind of big driver of stress and uncertainty for folks. And other kind of more specific pandemic related stresses there as well. So no wonder when we're talking about these high rates of mental health difficulty here that these numbers are going to be really inflated and really reflective of a population that's really struggling right now. And Dr. Brown talks about this idea, particularly when we're thinking about stress and family units, of this idea of kind of stress slowly kind of getting inside the family. That whereas perhaps prior to the pandemic, having some different resources or almost kind of buffers against that stress here, is that over time, it's really kind of worn down some of those defenses and positive coping mechanisms here to really kind of make a bit of a home there inside families. So whether that's been on kind of the child or youth end, or on kind of the parent caregiver end here, that we're seeing kind of families kind of bounce around and share this kind of stress in a really kind of bi-directional relationship focused kind of way here. And I think that's what a lot of families, at least that I'm hearing kind of in an anecdotal fashion, really kind of describe here, is that it's really kind of gotten inside, and sometimes it's hard to kind of point to and label, but it's really feeling like there's increased stress and kind of tension in the household. And we'll talk a little bit more about some different ideas and strategies here to move kind of forward from this. And again, just continuing here, Mental Health Research Canada. So they've done a series of, I think it's 10 or 11 polls now, again, kind of asking Canadians across the country, how are you doing right now? And you can see the numbers here, about 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 really reporting high levels of anxiety or depression. And that was despite right now in their latest polls, some of those worries about the actual health-related impacts of COVID being at an all-time low. So we know that there's a sizable portion of individuals who are really struggling. So perhaps not surprising there, again, a poll from CMHA there here in Ontario, 1 in 4 Ontarians reporting seeking kind of mental health support kind of during the pandemic, which really does line up with some of those numbers and figures there. And I really love this. So this is a bit dated here, but just a bit of a reflection of kind of the reality here for lots of families, but also individuals here too. So we've got on the left-hand side, Dr. Goldman here, looks like maybe doing a cameo here on CNN. I think it's related to geopolitical context or something like that. And yet on the right-hand side of the panel here, right, kind of just at a screenshot, just below the surface here, right, some of the chaos and kind of reality about balancing the multiple roles and hats and responsibilities that lots of families were feeling. And I am kind of wearing pants here today, but certainly, geez, there were days during the pandemic there, boy, on the other side of kind of my office door there, things certainly felt chaotic and very stressful. So whether that was on kind of the child side of things or kind of managing kind of the family unit, definitely the sense of heightened stress and vulnerability there for lots of folks. And on the child and youth side specifically, so some of the surveys coming out are really showing here that, perhaps not surprisingly, that that there are really high rates of children struggling kind of with their mental health. Perhaps you've seen different news-related articles about the rise in often adolescents seeking support around a disordered kind of problematic eating, so often around kind of eating disorders. And again, we're definitely going to need an investment around specialized supports in those kind of types of services. But I think also what we're not talking about, though, is that our kids and youth really weren't doing well kind of prior to the pandemic here as well. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific graphs and results around that. So I think what we will continue to kind of see here is that there are some specific impacts emerging for different groups, but that it's also quite complicated because there is a segment of kids there who are actually reporting doing a little bit better there as well due to changes throughout the pandemic. And again, what is that kind of all about? Well, we'll talk a little bit about some of the stresses behind that. And certainly, again, some of the research is really coming out here and emerging, but when we're talking about kind of the learning loss across kind of the school age children, and some of the estimates here are suggesting, anywhere in the ballpark of kind of 3 to 6 months. But again, I have an asterisk here because it really depends on the groups that you're surveying and what outcomes you're using here. And when we're looking at some of our youngest learners here, so I look at kind of my youngest here, who's in grade 1 right now, but started JK, junior kindergarten in March there, kind of during the pandemic, right? Some of the results showing about the number struggling and some of their early literacy skills. And what we're going to do as a community here to really support some of those youth who, again, compared to previous benchmarks, aren't kind of where they kind of should be. Now, I do have that in kind of quotations because it really is our expectations and benchmarks that we're kind of adjusting that to. So we're really going to have to think here about, again, kind of the mental health side, the school-related impacts, about how we continue to build those skills, appreciating where our kids are at kind of right now. So this is a great graph here. This is Dr. Tracy Vlanacourt from Ottawa here, asking in a longitudinal fashion here, a group of youth here, so 12 to 17, asking them to compare and reflect about where their mental health is at right now compared to pre-pandemic. So if you look at the blue line here, this is the largest line. So about 50% reporting saying about the same in terms of kind of their mental health. But if you look at the red line here, reporting kind of somewhat worse or much worse, so we're looking at about kind of 1 in 5 kids here, and almost kind of 1 in 3 here back in kind of the spring of last year. So we've got a sizable number of kids who are really struggling kind of due to the pandemic. Maybe about half here who are kind of treading water and are reporting about the same. And another smaller percentage here, again, about 1 in 5, maybe a little bit lower than that, reporting actually some more improved kind of mental health. So again, so when we begin to kind of have these kind of broad statements around kids and mental health, it's quite kind of complicated there because it really does depend on who we're asking and their age and some of the context, and going back to kind of the boat analogy, kind of what boat they've been sitting in over the course of the storm. Because if we look prior to the pandemic, again, our kind of gauges about how kids were doing actually wasn't quite positive here, as we knew that there was a bit of a mental health emergency here, again, even prior to kind of March 2020. We know that anxiety disorders, again, one of the most common forms of kind of mental health problems, about 6% of kids were meeting criteria for that kind of diagnostic criteria. And this is a survey here, so it's one of the longest running longitudinal surveys for kids in high school, asking them to report on their kind of their mental health and well-being, again, 12 to 17. So about 40% here reporting kind of moderate to severe psychological distress, 1 in 5 reporting their mental health as being fair or poor, and about 30% really reporting some of those elevated perceived stresses and pressures there. So again, we had a sizable chunk of kids here, even not thinking kind of diagnostically, who again, we're really kind of struggling here. So again, we're going to need a much more kind of refined understanding about who to kind of direct some of our, really kind of specialized resources and supports to, knowing that there are lots of kids who are struggling again, even prior to March 2020. And similarly, again, this is some 2017 kind of stats here, but 6 in 10 parents here who are reporting their kids have concern around kind of their levels of anxiety. 1 in 4 parents reporting kind of missing work or care obligations due to a child struggling with anxiety. And if you ask teachers, again, even prior to the pandemic here, but really perceiving large majority, 4 out of 5, insufficient kind of mental health supports in the community. And certainly that matches up with kind of my lived experiences here at the clinic about knowing that the numbers of kids that we're reaching and families that we're supporting is really just kind of the tip of the iceberg there. So what can we kind of do here kind of moving forward to really, again, kind of recognize where we're at and chart kind of a new course kind of moving forward? Well, for one piece here is to recognize that, schools are a big source of stressors for lots of kids. So this is one graph here out of Australia in New South Wales. And it's a bit of a unique model because they have year-round schooling, but there's kind of 4 spaced school terms there. And perhaps you might be able to kind of see here that the dips in here around emergency visits, around self-harm for adolescents here, actually dip kind of during those school kind of breaks. And another graph here, just reporting the increased admissions at, again, emergency departments around self-harm. We can see kind of that 58% increase kind of during kind of the typical kind of school day, weekday, kind of Monday to Friday. So, and that's often kind of what we're seeing here, a little bit of when we're looking into some of these surveys here about, for some kids who are reporting kind of feeling a little bit better and their mental health being a little bit more improved, is that lots of these kids who are reporting improved kind of mental health were those who were really struggling kind of prior to the pandemic. So often around school-related pressures, social-related anxieties and pressures. But at the same time, having maybe kind of a new group of kids who perhaps kind of weren't struggling before, now struggling in some kind of new ways that, again, hadn't been kind of on their radar previously. So that's all to kind of say, and we'll talk a little bit more about here that it really is kind of complicated right now, depending on kind of how you kind of slice that kind of demographic pie and looking at kind of the resources that they've been able to be connected to over the past kind of 2 years. So again, what are we going to kind of do here as a community kind of moving forward here, knowing some of the really kind of the current realities and pressures. And there were lots of kids who weren't getting support, again, prior to the pandemic. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about some of our work here at the clinic and some of our ideas kind of moving forward about kind of where we need to go. And I'll highlight Paula's really kind of unique program here as well, which I think is definitely on kind of the right path here about what we need to be thinking about. So our work here at the Mary J. Wright Child and Youth Development Clinic is a training clinic here. So we are kind of a fee-based training clinic, but also with the sliding scale to really promote accessibility for clients. And as kind of a training ground for our students here, so there are some of our future counselors, psychologists, and social workers here, is that we really provide kind of a pretty rich learning environment where they provide kind of firsthand support to families, but under the support of registered psychologists and supervisors like myself. We've been in operation for 4 years here. And when we started off here on this kind of journey here supporting our community, it was really the idea of kind of doing something different, about to be inclusive and collaborative, to be strength-based, to be interdisciplinary in our work, and to be able to personalize some of the services that we could provide to families. But being in an academic role here for this work to be really kind of evaluated and to have a role here and really kind of driving some of our future research and service delivery as well. And that's where I'm really excited to have a role here around on the research side of as well about what we can be doing a little bit differently. So our site here provides a training environment for students here across 5 programs: school and applied child psychology, clinical psychology, social work, and counseling, with kind of an internship here as well that we support over the course of a full year. And over the last 4 years here, we've been able to train 85 students, whether their placement was a month all the way up to a year. We supported 750 kind of plus unique clients at this point. And I think probably over 1,000 kind of referrals here, in part because, again, we know that there's such pressure and demand there for mental health and to be able to receive kind of services. In our work here, our goal is really to support kids who are struggling in their learning, mental health, and behavior, knowing that there's a real intimate connection there between learning and success academically and confidence and self-esteem and mental health. And with the guidelines of really being able to support school-age kids. So from kind of 3 to kind of 18 years of age is really kind of our mandate, though. Kids who are still in kind of high school or elementary school there. And in our provision of services here, we provide assessment services. So whether that be around suspected learning challenges, ADHD, intervention here as well around anxiety, depression, grief and loss. And similar to today, we've been able to do a number of different community events, consultation for families there as well, in addition to different trainings for different groups. So think about some of our work we've done with early childhood educators about supporting kids with anxiety coming to school. How do we make that a little bit more of an easier process on their end and on kind of the teacher side of things? So I'll just quickly touch base about this. So I mentioned again in the assessment domain, really around learning disorders, ADHD, suspected kind of developmental or intellectual challenges. And some of the work we've been doing here that I've been really kind of proud of is some of our kind of partnerships we have really across with other faculties. So we have an interesting program right now where we pair some of our teacher candidates, so some of our future teachers, and our graduate psychology students together, again, with this idea of doing screenings around kind of the mental health and the learning side. And from that, they develop kind of learning plans and learning profiles for students to help guide some of those academic next steps. Intervention-wise here, again, some of the individual and intervention group programming. And in groups here, again, really trying to be responsive to what we're hearing from the community around, whether it be kind of grief and adjustment, compassion-focused therapy. Boy, I think we all need a little bit of that right now on kind of the adults and kind of caregiver side of things, and some of the other programs that we've offered historically around anxiety and self-regulation. I apologize here. I must have some automatic transitions or something. So this is our building here. So if you've ever gone past the Richmond kind of gates here at the universities, we're in a converted bank here, the old BMO building. And in our kind of converted space here, we've got kind of a welcoming kind of main floor. And in the basement where we have individual rooms. So we can see our students here through the use of our recording software. It looks like they're doing two assessments and an intake interview, but that they can be provided with feedback and guidance there about kind of what they're doing. They can review some of their footage and work to really guide some of their professional next steps there. And just one example here of some of the collaborative community events that we've done as a way of trying to, again, start some community conversations about kind of where we're at right now. And again, this just examples here prior to the pandemic, but we've been doing this over webinars here as well. So I just provide that as a bit of a highlight here to talk a little bit about some of kind of the lessons learned perhaps, or some of the ideas about, I think, where our roadmap needs to look like kind of moving forward. And increasingly, I'm thinking about, what level are we really trying to kind of target here in some of our support kind of moving forward? We certainly are continuing to do some of that individual focused, N=1, that type of work with individual kind of children and youth, but to do some of that work with kind of parents as well, that's been a big focus. But also kind of families and increasingly kind of communities here as we're trying to recognize, again, the shared space that we're in, knowing that, we're all kind of struggling to some various degrees. And perhaps if it's not us individually, know someone who is kind of struggling. So again, what's our role as a larger community here kind of moving forward? So what I want to do is talk a little bit at kind of the family lens here. Again, some of the ideas that, again, we may be able to borrow from kind of moving forward. And one is certainly around the idea here, if you've heard around kind of co-regulation. The idea that my kind of skill sets and my ability to regulate myself here has an important reciprocal role in developing those skills in kind of our kids. And we know that this kind of changes over the course as kids get older there, and that, even our young adults here on the verge of adulthood still need often kind of some of that co-regulation to be able to kind of calm ourselves, to feel kind of confident together. But this is really a process that begins right all the way from kind of day one there as a new infant there, about really depending on their caregiver there to help kind of soothe them, right? Providing that secure base and attachment that are developing those kind of signals and clues and skill set here about that you're okay, and we can kind of move forward kind of together. And of course, that kind of changes across kind of the developmental stage there. But I think increasingly, I'm going back to these ideas here, knowing that, again, so many adults are struggling with the idea here that I think, as go the kids, so will go kind of the parents and vice versa here. As the parents go, so the kind of the kids will go. And can we start having some kind of larger family conversations about kind of how we're doing? So what that kind of looks like, I think, is, whereas before we were touching base again about individual kind of parents or individual kind of children here, to have a bit of a larger focus about kind of how everyone's kind of doing. What are we kind of most excited about, and kind of this landscape that we're in right now? What are the things that we're kind of worried or maybe kind of wondering about? Right. And that, boy, I think there's lots on the plates here for everybody here that, maybe have some inklings or things there that we're starting to pay attention to, maybe in ways that we perhaps kind of haven't before. So whether that's kind of inflation fears or children worried about going back to, traditional models of education and all the demands that come with that. Can we do kind of take a pulse and check in with everyone kind of in the family? And have some, pretty frank and transparent conversations here about, how we've been handling kind of stress and change, and what's gone well over the past 2 years, perhaps kind of what's been most challenging for us. What have we kind of learned over the course of the past 2 years here about, each other, and about what we might need in more individualized kind of nature. It's a bit embarrassing in many ways, but boy, I think it took me probably about 1.5 years, even a little bit later, to recognize that for me, some of that real kind of intense physical exercise there was something that I really needed to be part of kind of my continuum and kind of toolbox here about kind of being at my best, and that I really had to kind of make time for that in a really kind of advanced, intentional way there. Just knowing that, again, I needed to be at my best to support kind of my kids there as well. So having some pretty kind of honest conversations there about where we're at and what we kind of might need moving forward, knowing that whether things have gone well or not gone well, this is all information we can use there to add to our kind of much more nuanced understanding. And I think that's what's so exciting about that, is that we are now talking about this in some pretty tangible ways. And I think as we kind of resume perhaps some sense of kind of normalcy here for families, about trying to avoid perhaps that rush to go back to kind of baseline. So trying to kind of balance out activities and the other kind of transitions that we're building over the next kind of months. To recognize, again, that kind of time and importance of kind of self-care, the opportunities to be able to kind of self-regulate on our own or kind of with our kids or students that we're supporting. And I think that is a big piece, again, kind of anecdotally, of we've kind of lost our way over the last 2 years here about not knowing what really kind of calm kind of feels like, in the family, for kids as well. And how do we kind of set that up for success in kind of our little units here? So whether that be around kind of sleep and, routine and predictability, despite perhaps all the excitement about being able to do the things that we haven't done before as well. Here, and the idea here, if you're familiar with Dr. Ross Green, he talks about, kind of kids do well if they can. And I absolutely believe that to be the case for about 99.5% of kids here. But I think that extends to parents, adults, and really everyone, that, people want to be at kind of their best selves. And if they're not bringing their best self at that particular moment, in that particular day and time there, that it's probably reflective of skill challenges getting in kind of the way right now. Right, so how do we be compassionate of our expectations about ourselves and other people, and knowing that, it's really kind of relationships first, to really, that has to be kind of our thread moving forward here, to be able to have kind of those much more often challenging conversations about where folks are at and what we kind of need moving forward. Is it really starts with kind of the relationships as kind of that fourth R there, whether that be schools or certainly kind of in families there too. And if I think about at the adult level here, and thinking about kind of parents and kind of caregivers, to have, again, some pretty kind of honest conversations there about checking in about kind of our own kind of reality here, right? Of thinking certainly in kind of a occupational or work context here as well. Again, speaking for myself here, right? Some of the excitement of really kind of returning to the workplace and being able to kind of perhaps be successful in those goals and all those project plans that I really had to shelve kind of over the last kind of 18 months there around that. But knowing there that, again, that's probably not setting kind of myself up for success. And that when we think about self-care, so whether it's in a purely kind of, kind of perhaps individualized way here, knowing the research really does show that strong kind of return on investment there about kind of self-care. And this isn't just kind of, bubble baths or, time on Netflix here, but a real concerted, intentional effort here as part of regular care and planning here to kind of be at our best. And knowing that, again, caregivers do often act as kind of that feeling kind of thermostat in the family about how we reflect and validate kind of feelings, how we manage some of the additional pressure and stress that comes with big feelings often in the moment. So again, how can we set ourselves up for a strong foundation there to be able to support those who might be struggling? And increasingly in some of our work here and the webinars that we're doing, this idea of kind of being an emotion coach kind of for our kids there. And, I do think some of this has been, some reduced learning time, particularly for younger learners in a school context. But, we know that there's lots of kids who need that explicit focus there on developing that emotional vocabulary and social emotional skills there to be an accurate kind of reporter of kind of how they're feeling. Right. And we often talk about kind of kids being able to kind of calm down and regulate, right? Kind of settle down, calm down, but that's really predicated on a whole host of different skills there. And it really starts with, again, kids knowing kind of how they're feeling, right? Knowing that, boy, I'm perhaps kind of feeling frustrated right now, or maybe a little bit frustrated, but actually maybe I'm more embarrassed. To be able to have that kind of reflected back to me by the adults kind of in my life. And then really the next steps of what do I then kind of need to kind of do with that information? Do I want to kind of stay with this feeling or kind of shift somewhere else? And again, I think that's the space we're in right now here about perhaps all of us perhaps not being a little bit sure of kind of how we're kind of feeling. So how do we bring in that emotional vocabulary and SEL skills here to promote regulation and coping? Up in here, there we go. And so that's where I really think kind of moving forward here, despite, the landscape that we're in here, I think it is giving us some kind of new opportunities here to really rethink some traditional models of support. We knew the hundreds, if not thousands of kids on long kind of waiting lists in our public kind of pathways and institutions, and those will continue to be, need to be an investment and funding for those. But I also think with, again, the large percentage of kids and families who are struggling here is, maybe there's some other new pathways that can come from this, that can provide some greater flexibility in recognizing that the mental health of parents and adults are ultimately integrated and with our kids and kind of youth are doing. Right? So how do we support the adults in all this as well who are coming out of the pandemic with really kind of 2 years here of trying to kind of hold often kind of family units and all those demands kind of hanging on by a thread here. So with that in mind, I think there are some real interesting opportunities around partnerships, so whether that be schools and communities, schools and families together. And I'm on a number of initiatives here where we're starting to have those conversations about people kind of rowing together in the same boat in ways that maybe perhaps we didn't do prior to the pandemic, which is really exciting. And I think, as much as we've had mental health services really focused around those at kind of a tier 3 level, meeting criteria for a diagnosis, we really need to be thinking much more earlier here about early intervention opportunities, talking about how we're doing and knowing that it's not only an opportunity to prevent future distress, but it's much easier to build those skills kind of in the moment. And this is just one example here of kind of one research project that we're starting in the next month or two here at the clinic about really just kind of working with parents when anxiety symptoms first show up among some of our kind of youngest kiddos there. Kind of really kind of in that 6 to 9 kind of window. So can we support the parents here to support the kids even prior to it becoming kind of a full-blown kind of anxiety disorder and really kind of getting in the way there. And then again, this is where, again, I think we are often stuck between, kind of business as usual here and trying to do something different and wanting something different that's not working either. So I think trying to kind of rethink, and that's why I love these conversations we're happening, because it's always driving my work about what I'm hearing in kind of the trenches and the ground levels here about what families and parents and youth are kind of needing right now. And that's where increasingly here, I think, the path forward, at least from my lens, is that we'll continue to have these conversations. Yes, we need the specialized services and supports here for youth who are, again, struggling in kind of unique or even kind of heightened ways. But I think there's some interesting opportunities here to, again, to continue these conversations with families and communities, recognizing that, perhaps that baseline has shifted for lots of us here. So how do we kind of move forward with that kind of new reality? And that's where I'm, so thankful to have Paula, who's on the call here today, Paula Jesse from MI Understanding, that in partnership developing kind of the MI kind of Friends program, which is really designed to really kind of promote those early conversations with families when kind of kids are struggling. So maybe on this point here, Paula, I'll hand it over to you if you don't mind sharing a little bit about MI Friends.
Absolutely. Thank you, Colin. I think the key thing with MI Friends, just to complement all the great stuff that Dr. King said today, is the fact that we've created a resource that really breaks through a couple of barriers. One, we heard that families who desperately want to get support don't sometimes know the language and feel a little bit isolated and alone at 9 o'clock at night when they're the only ones dealing with it. So this is an online resource to really help families start those conversations at home. That's key. The second piece with this is again, it's an online resource families can use. There's a resource that kids get as well. But I think one of the key things with this partnership and with this program is the fact that we realized one of the biggest barriers was cost. So thanks to incredible organizations like SelectPath and Optimist International, we're able to provide this program to families at no cost. I think we might be quite close to the end of time, are we not?
We have a little bit of time. If you want to go through this slide, Paula, you can. And then we've got a little bit of time for questions. If people have anything, they can start throwing them in the chat for me as well.
Perfect. Well, again, as we look at this slide, we're really helping to bridge that gap to care. So MI Friends is part of MI Understanding, and we've been in operation now for about 6 years and working quite closely with Dr. King and his team, really to create resources, as I said, that help families start those conversations. A lot of it is really starting early on. Early intervention is the key. And we found with these resources, if that character looks familiar, the folks who built them used to work with Jim Henson. But we found with creating these videos with our community partners, using them in schools and community groups and with families, that hands went up and kids really started talking about their feelings. And it was something that gave adults something that they could feel confident when they were delivering the message. We were just in an event on the weekend. There was over 300 children, and I'm constantly amazed at the number of families that were absolutely grateful for the resource, grateful that it wasn't another cost out of their pocket. And it was another opportunity for them to really be open about the fact that, yes, they were struggling at home. Yes, it really was difficult what they were going through right now. And they were grateful for anything that supported them. We've really tried to design this for the family. It's really easy to use. It's really easy to integrate into their lives. And it's a great opportunity to start that early communication between children and their parents around mental health.
Awesome.
Great, and I'll just wrap up here sharing again, when we're thinking about some, mental health and where our kids are at, it is kind of complicated. We need to continue to have the conversations kind of like today. And the message I'm trying to deliver to families and kids is that we can do hard things with patience, understanding, and also kind of meeting kids where they're at kind of right now. So I think we'll be able to do this together though, as opposed to certainly kind of individually.
Awesome. So would love to open it up for questions. Thank you so much, Dr. King, for that information, and Paula. We at SelectPath are really proud to be involved in this program. I think for us, mental wellness and mental resiliency and all those tools are not just an adult thing. We need to be taking care of our kids. I was saying at the beginning to Dr. King, as a parent of a child with some mental health concerns, having access to support is something that's so critical, especially if I think back to the time when I was in the workplace when my daughter was quite sick, and the impact that that had on me at work. So having those resources and support are so important, and being able to provide them for no cost or not having cost as a limitation is absolutely critical. So Paula's contact information is there, as well as Dr. King's, and if anybody needs it, you can definitely reach out to Select Path as well. We have access to the contact info if you need it, but would love to open it up. We do have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has anything that they would like to ask our experts for today, I can put them out there. There's nothing there yet, but I know it's a hard topic and a big topic, so questions are sometimes a little more challenging. So the first one that we have, Paula, might be for you. So what's the age range for the Am I Understanding program?
My understanding program is really 12 and under, and it's amazing. I mean, the topic is children, the target is parents. So we find it's a strong program for kids 12 and under. 12-year-olds are funny folk. They're either old 12 or they're young 12. And if it's an older 12, it's still a really good resource for families just to get some strategies on how to support their youngster.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any other questions? Nothing yet. We might be good for today. I never want to cut it off too quick because I'm always hesitant that as soon as I say, okay, that's it, that then something's going to pop up and we're going to close and there's no coming back. Are there early signs of mental health issues in really young kids?
That's a great question. You know, I always, in the conversations I'm having with families, is really kind of referencing often kind of their baseline. We know that, you know, parents, I believe that they're kind of the experts of their kids, and that they have a good gauge of, again, kind of what's kind of typical, you know, what's kind of personality and, you know, temperament pieces versus indicating that, boy, that, you know, they might be struggling a little bit more. Some of those emotions or behaviors are getting a little bit bigger, maybe suggestive that, you know, that there's something kind of either bothering them or something underneath kind of the surface there. And that's why I think some of the conversations with schools are really interesting there as well, about, you know, trying to kind of get that kind of 360 lens about how our kids are doing at kind of multiple kind of contexts and instances there too.
Awesome, thank you.
And maybe just as we're wrapping up here, Mel, I'll just put a brief plug here. Again, some great resources here, you know, thinking about self-compassion for parents in particular. Susan Polak's got a great book, and Pandemic Parenting, a wonderful kind of resource there for parents, really talking about some of the, you know, lived realities in the space that we're kind of either in right now or kind of exiting, that really speaks to these kind of issues for families too.
That whole oxygen mask theory.
Absolutely, boy, there's something to be said for that, right?
Yeah,
completely.
Awesome. Okay, it looks like that's the end for our questions. So Dr. King and Paula, thank you so much for your information today. I'm sure we all got a lot out of it. We'll include the PowerPoint for everybody, just so you know, in the email when we send it out, so that everybody's got that with the recording. And that'll give you access to the resources as well. And just for everybody's information who is on the call, our next month Exemplify will be on financial wellness, again, with a focus on the challenges that have come because of the pandemic and the inflation that we're dealing with right now. So those day-to-day stresses of increased living costs. So that will be next month's topic. We have some experts from solveyourdebts.com, which is a not-for-profit credit counseling organization. So that will be our next month's topic. So we'll get you that information as well. And for everyone who joined us today, thank you very much. And we will hopefully see you next month. Have an awesome day. Bye, everybody.